You're listening to the Shared Security Podcast with Tom Eston and Scott Wright, exploring the trust you put in people, apps, and technology.
Hosted by Scott Wright, the Streetwise Security Coach, and Tom Eston, penetration tester and ethical hacker. And sponsored by Security Perspectives, your source for tailored security awareness training and assessment solutions. We bring you stories, advice, and tips to help you make better risk decisions because nobody else can make them for you.
Episode 70, an industrial strength discussion of insider threat psychology with Dr. Helen Ofosu.
Hello and welcome to the Shared Security Podcast. I'm Scott Wright, the Streetwise Security Coach, and I'm here as usual with Tom Eston in Cleveland. Hey, Tom.
Hey, Scott. How are you?
Not too bad. And today we have a special guest, Dr. Helen Ofosu, here in Ottawa with me. Not physically with me, but she is a colleague of mine that I've worked with, and just would like to welcome her to the show. Welcome, Helen.
Thanks very much. I'm happy to be here.
So before we get started, for the benefit of any new listeners who may be joining us for the first time, and especially those coming from Helen's network and her followers, I think we should start with a quick intro for Tom and myself, and then we'll find out about Helen's background and her specialty. So, Tom?
Yeah, so Tom Eston, I'm one of the co-founders of the podcast. We've been doing this since 2009, so quite a while. Yeah, my background is in information security, cybersecurity. I currently work for an application security company called Veracode, which is out of Boston. We were actually recently purchased by CA Technologies, which is a larger company, much larger global company. But I run their manual penetration testing team. So I get to corral the ethical hackers, where companies pay us to test their security and to see if we can find vulnerabilities in their applications.
Thanks, Tom. And I'm Scott Wright, based in Ottawa. I'm a security coach and consultant who helps teams work more securely by educating their staff on cybersecurity risks, and also by doing innovative solutions for assessing vulnerabilities and assurance of staff when it comes to security and privacy. So in order to secure the future of your business, you should really start with a streetwise team. Okay, so Helen is what we call, or what some people call, an industrial organizational psychologist, which I had never heard of before, but it's a very cool thing. So what I'm going to do is let Helen give us a little bit of information on her background and what she does as an industrial organizational psychologist. And we're going to actually be talking about insider threats and the psychology around it, which I think should be a lot of fun. So Helen, maybe if you could just take a couple of minutes and enlighten us on your background and what you do.
Absolutely. I'll start with the very clunky title, Industrial and Organizational Psychology. Other countries are smarter. They call it work psychology or business psychology. And essentially what it is applying kind of a scientific study or approach to human behavior in organizations and in the workplace. So it's very much focused on increasing workplace productivity and related issues, things like physical and mental well-being, and it certainly gets much more relevant in higher stakes hiring situations, career development, succession planning, those kinds of issues.
Cool. Would you say that bigger organizations are typically the ones that would have someone like yourself on staff, or is there any particular industry that has more of that kind of a role?
Seeing how Apple seems to be selecting people, I'm pretty sure that they count on IO psychologists. And I get the sense also that Google and other larger companies seem to appreciate the kinds of insights that we can offer.
Cool.
But certainly outside of tech as well. It's not limited to tech.
Cool. Didn't mean to interrupt you, so please continue.
Yeah, I'm sure people may wonder how it is that I got into this whole topic of insider threats. And I'd say it was probably 2 years ago when I was talking with a colleague about some of the work that I do in terms of outplacement, and outplacement is basically coaching related services that are paid for by an employer when an employee is leaving the organization. So it's basically some assistance to help that person relaunch in a new role or a new organization. And he was curious about whether or not I deal with volatile outplacements. So, of course, he was thinking of things like an active shooter scenario where somebody literally goes postal. And no, thank goodness I have never been involved with those kinds of things. Those are fairly rare. But there are lots of other things that happen that are a lot more common, but less grand. So those kinds of issues that are complicated and negative relating to outplacements kind of do link to some of the work I'm doing. So one example could be, well, somebody's been let go from an organization. Now they're financially vulnerable and they have all kinds of corporate information. So that, even though the person has left, that person is an insider threat just because of the access that they've had and the damage that can happen if things go poorly. So that's kind of what made me stumble upon this area. But it also reminded me of some work that I had done years earlier in a top secret environment. And there, of course, they understood the importance of protecting valuable information from external threats, so the classic cyber issues, but they also recognized the importance of protecting the organization from internal threats, including leaks and that kind of thing.
That's cool.
Hmm.
So what you do now in this area is essentially on a contract basis help organizations in terms of screening. Is that how it would work, or assessment of employees that are currently employed?
Both, in a sense. Certainly, the approach that I take to hiring helps organizations prevent hiring people that are more likely to be involved with these kinds of problems. And the kinds of HR policies and procedures and organizational cultures that I try to foster also make organizations more resilient from these kinds of insider threats. And then the final piece is that when employees have to leave an organization, I strongly recommend that people have graceful exits, not traumatic exits, not the kinds of exits that make them angry and financially motivated and vulnerable to doing things that would hurt the organization, but are things that they feel they have to do in order just to survive.
That's
Does
cool.
that make sense to you?
Yeah. So could you give us an example of what would constitute a graceful exit?
Well, here's an example. I mean, in many situations, when somebody has to leave an organization and it's a unilateral decision that the organization's making, they can make it harder for an employee or they can make it easier for an employee. So, for instance, let's say there's been an acquisition and now there's a redundancy, so somebody has to go. Instead of just sending them packing and being harsh about it, it does make sense on many levels to give that person some severance that they're entitled to, and also give them some support to make sure that when they leave, they are supported so they can help find a new position and stay productive and focused on getting something else in place. So they don't have enough time to get angry and caught up in things that aren't really productive. Rather, they can be focused on where they're headed and knowing that they have enough of a buffer in terms of severance money that they aren't pressured to finding something tomorrow. They have a little bit of a runway in order to get reestablished in something else.
Yeah, I guess
some help.
At some point, you probably don't have an awful lot of flexibility. If it's a for cause kind of dismissal or something like that, right? It has to be done right away, and there's certain things you have to do to make sure that people are, not able to retaliate. But I think, are there things that could be done to make that part of it easier, or is that just part of the, a difficult part of the job?
Well, you know what? You make a good point. In those for cause situations, I'm sure that quite often the motivation is to say, you know what? This person had it coming. They should get going. And that's it. That's all. But still, in that situation, offering some kind of outplacement services so that person has a little bit of support and they can focus their energies on what they're going to do next to further their career in a constructive way instead of leaving them drifting in the wind and angry and at odds for what to do next. Because sometimes people get unhinged in those situations. And if they have a lot of anger and a lot of time, and they're financially very vulnerable and scared about how they're going to take care of their expenses, that creates quite a cocktail, quite a situation where things could get bad very quickly. So it's counterproductive to still provide some support in those situations, but I think that the risk is greater than the small investment in helping them stay focused on something constructive.
Cool. So in the case where you have an employee that may be a risk, how can an employer detect that if it's just sort of not happened yet? Is there any kind of preemptive or sort of proactive activity that an employer can take to try and reduce those risks?
Well, in my experience, most organizations aren't structured in a way that makes it easy for them to know when there are certain things happening in an employee's life that makes them more vulnerable to manipulation or other things that trigger them becoming an insider threat. Because I'm not saying that we should have a police state where we're monitoring employees or anything like that. But for instance, if you know that somebody is going through a very difficult divorce and you are unable to provide some flexibility for that person to take some time off to deal with lawyer appointments and maybe court appointments and all that kind of stuff, the stress of it is terrible. And in the end, if somebody has all kinds of pressures that they have no way to cope with, it just creates opportunities for them to do things that are counterproductive for the organization and in many ways counterproductive for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in this situation, it's not that obvious how the divorce would be. I mean, it's obvious in terms of maybe financial pressures, but not all organizations have a culture where things that are happening in an employee's life are necessarily known to HR or known to the senior leadership who has an opportunity to structure things in a way that's better for that employee.
Right. So do some organizations like explicitly try to sort of take the pulse of the employee base or identify employees that are potentially at risk?
I don't think it's very systematic. I mean, certainly in my experience in the more top secret environment, there are periodic check-ins that are related to renewing security clearances. And whenever there's a change in marital status or a change in cohabitation, usually those are things where there's supposed to be some mandatory reporting. Those are not typical things that happen in regular organizations. And, with boundaries and with trying to maintain privacy and all the rest of it, I don't think that kind of stuff is normally factored in. But from what I've read, it's not necessarily people who are, suffering from mental illness or have certain particular personality traits who become malicious insiders. Rather, it's usually circumstances that trigger these issues. Sometimes the circumstances are personal, but in many cases, the circumstances are more organizational. So there may have been an organizational change that's dramatic, or there may have been a merger or an acquisition or a restructuring. Those kinds of events usually precede problems.
Right. And I suppose one of the obvious things would then be just to make sure that you have a program in place where people know they can go to get help or ask what they should do if they are facing some kind of crisis at home.
Yeah, and I think a lot of organizations do make employee assistance programs available, EAP programs available to their staff.
Mm-hmm.
So many of the bigger issues, whether it's addictions to substances or gambling or marital issues or other kind of mental health issues, those things are often well covered. But there are a couple of gaps. For instance, if an organization has had some bullying or harassment that hasn't really become public knowledge, it's been happening, so the people who were involved know about it, but it's never been brought to HR. Sometimes those are more challenging situations because they're causing a lot of turmoil for the person on the receiving end. And again, that's the kind of thing that could make somebody very angry, very disgruntled, and a good candidate for trying to stick it to the organization for not protecting them. And those kinds of things are not so well covered in terms of EAPs or classic therapy because the issue isn't really a mental health issue. The mental health issue is the consequence, but really the problem is more organizational and work related. And those are not so easy to deal with.
It's an interesting situation. Like we're seeing a lot of that kind of thing now. The harassment, that's coming out all over the place, right? That it's going to need to be addressed.
I was just going to mention that it's really just in the last couple of weeks, it's been kind of shocking. And what's interesting to me, and maybe you could comment on this, Helen, is how most of these revelations happen usually after the employee or group of employees have left an organization for whatever reason. And it seems like it's even 6 months to a year in some cases later. What are your thoughts on that in terms of how people are now disclosing issues they've had with their employer or harassment or abuse issues?
Well, it's a huge topic. And honestly, I'd say easily 30-40% of my career coaching clients are people who have been on the receiving end of this kind of awful treatment. Mm-hmm. And so sometimes I will get involved to help them when they've already suffered and now they've taken time off work just to partially recover. And they're trying to create a good exit strategy so that they can leave that bad situation and get into another role at another organization. Generally speaking, these bullying situations, unless you get lawyers involved, and many people don't want to go that route for many reasons, they recognize that it's just so much simpler to leave than it is to try to fix that bad situation. A lot of organizations, may not want to deal with the bully, especially if that person is seen as being a great contributor, a great salesperson, somebody who has great productivity, good numbers, what have you. But they don't really think about some of the consequences associated with that person's behavior. So generally speaking, I usually help people get out of those situations because very few organizations want to deal with it or are equipped to deal with it.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's incredibly unfortunate.
Yeah, I mean, this actually then starts to go into the organizational culture issue and the leadership area, right? I think if you look at the recent Uber news story, right, we in the security world, we're talking about the hack and the cover up that Uber executives basically paid hackers that obtained some data from their website or their network and paid them to be quiet and delete the data. And when you see that leadership is doing that kind of thing, you got to wonder about what other things might be wrong in the culture, right? And Uber actually has a history. I think last year there were complaints about harassment and things like that within the organization that caused changes of leadership at the top. Is that right, Tom?
Yeah, that's correct. There were firings.
Yeah. So
it's difficult difficult because when people see other people being mistreated and not being held to account, it kind of signals that that's okay. And if that's okay, then it makes other things seem okay. So there's certainly research that suggests that incivility breeds more incivility. And when that kind of stuff is let run, when it runs rampant without being addressed, then it creates opportunities for other so-called bad behaviors to go unchecked. Because in the Uber situation, I'm sure that a few people knew about it, but from what they had seen about other things that had been unaddressed, they probably didn't want to be the outlier there saying, hey, wait a second, this is happening. This isn't good. Can somebody address this? Can somebody fix this? It's hard to be that one voice.
Yeah.
It's hard to be an effective bystander when you see bad things happening and nobody's, everyone else is kind of looking down at their shoes or looking away or pretending not to see it.
Is it really like a personal decision on whether an employee acts on stuff that looks illegal or unethical, that's happening? Or is it something that the organization really needs to take responsibility for, making sure that people know what to do?
Well, the organization should know, and good leaders do know what to do. Good leaders intervene when they see bad things happening. But sometimes there are reasons why organizations want to take the easier path, which may be unethical, may be illegal. But, obviously it's been happening. If we look at what's happening with the hashtag #MeToo and Uber and other organizations, these things happen. And I don't think they happen in a vacuum.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's sort of some of the things that I think have, I don't know how well they work, but they seem to work in the idea of having a whistleblower program where there's some amount of anonymity or protection of the person who's reporting the problem. Is that becoming more common now?
I wish it were becoming more common, but I'm not convinced that it is that common. Because if things, just from what I see about unethical behavior around harassment and bullying, that's even easier to address than some of these bigger issues are. And if nobody wants to come forward and say, yes, that's true, I have seen such and such, then it's hard to believe that higher stakes issues that might be illegal in a different sense and maybe have financial consequences for the organization, it's hard to see how those things are going to be taken seriously.
Right.
Because sometimes there's a difference between an organization's practice values and their stated values.
Right.
You may have a policy that says, we're going to protect whistleblowers, but when you see whistleblowers become sidelined or disciplined or fired, then you don't have any confidence that those stated values are really what's being followed in practice.
So would you say it's more the case that there just aren't whistleblower programs in place, or that the ones that are just not effective or not taken seriously?
I suspect it's the latter. I suspect that a lot of organizations may have things in writing, but in practice, things get bungled. Mm-hmm. And people feel reluctant to count on them because, let's face it, their livelihoods are at stake as well.
Right. And, from my point of view, management should want an effective whistleblower program in place just as an oversight, right? For, you trust your management to do the right thing. But when there are personalities involved, people not getting along with their managers, sometimes it's the manager that's the difficult one, right? And if people feel they can't go to their manager and take other actions instead, then it can really complicate things from an IT security or any other kind of risk point of view.
That's it. Those power differentials are a big deal. When people up the chain of command are part of the problem, then unless you have some kind of employee surveys or something where people have confidence that what they say is actually going to be heard somewhere and it may not be attributed in a way that causes them vulnerability, then you don't hear much.
Yeah, maybe the most visible example of that was Edward Snowden, right?
Oh my goodness, of course.
Yeah.
And I'm sure he tried to report. I mean, I don't know every detail about that whole scenario, but no doubt, I do know that he tried to bring these issues to the attention of superiors, and clearly nobody was listening. And it's unfortunate, but he found a good listener in that journalist.
Yeah. And did you have any comments, Tom?
No, I was going to say, it seems to be that's the outlet these days of, they go to the press or they go to a journalist like, Edward Snowden to report things. And that is also an interesting thing, too, because there's a lot of risk doing that, especially if you're currently employed, where, you can put your own job in jeopardy and maybe your own transition plan. But yeah, I find that fascinating, too, that is also the trend of especially in these harassment cases that, they really don't know what else to do but to tell the media and to get the word out about, the practices of an organization.
Yeah, and the other option, or the other way it sometimes plays out, is the example that I can think of from 2013, where in the city of San Francisco, I think the IT administrator that essentially withheld his passwords for all the network systems from his management because he either wanted job security or he didn't trust them. So, I mean, that's another option people may turn to if they don't have a way to deal with issues that they're concerned about.
Yeah. And I think, too, from just IT security perspective, how people with the keys of the kingdom, right, within a corporate network or, people that have higher privileged access within an organization, that's always challenging when, not just people, being fired, but people that have put in their notice, they're going to another organization, maybe leaving on good terms. But, leaving on good terms could mean different things for different people, right? I mean, they're putting 2 weeks in because maybe they're upset at their manager and they don't like working with them. So maybe on the side, they're kind of, siphoning off, corporate data and giving it to the competition, or, and that's where you see things like, NDAs and non-compete things coming into play. But those are the things that I know concerning to, tech companies, right, that have a lot of these people, very smart people too, that can do a lot of damage. I am curious, Helen, what your take is on non-compete agreements. If those are things that, are those really valuable to an organization to keep things kind of secret and keep people in check, or what's your take on that?
I think they're smart to have in place, but personally, I think that those are interventions of last resort, because let's face it, somebody can outwardly appear that they are happy at work. They haven't given notice. They're showing up every day. They're doing their work, but they may be funneling or leaking information to competitors or whoever because of, maybe it could be that they've been incentivized by an outsider to do things, or maybe they're getting back at somebody, or maybe they have financial pressures that have made them vulnerable, and now they're selling stuff to solve the problem. So, in my mind, NDAs and non-competition agreements, they're good to have, but if you ever need one, odds are that the damage would have already been done by the time you get to court.
Yep.
And not everything is digital. We sometimes forget that some of these problems are caused by kind of old school analog issues. A lot can be expressed through a conversation. You don't have to be downloading reams and reams of data. Sometimes a lot of damage can be done by explaining strategic plans and priorities and projects and things that are in the pipeline.
Yeah, and there could also be bartering or other types of, exchanges of value other than what you would see defined in a non-compete or NDA, right?
And the truth is that even with those documents in place, if somebody has already given away the core of a new approach or a technology or what have you by explaining it, in great detail, then the competitor may have gone ahead and monetized it before you can even get to court.
Yeah, it's very hard to sort of put a value on it in advance, right? A lot of times I think you see in those agreements some way to try and quantify and then multiply the, the potential value to make it, more of a disincentive. But like you said, it's very hard to try to even put a value on it at that point.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. So I guess we're getting pretty long on time now. So I think just wanted to sort of offer you any last thoughts, Helen, in terms of things that you think employers in general could do to try and make their situation better from a point of view of insider threats and the psychological side of it.
Well, I think that this is one of those occasions where treating employees well may actually be something that helps organizations stay more resilient. So by having fair hiring practices that are effective and put the right people into the right role, that helps. Making sure that you have promotion opportunities that are based on merit and fair, so that people don't become frustrated and discouraged by the fact that they don't really have much career mobility. Dealing with bullying and harassment, these are all basic things that really could go a long way to helping organizations become a lot more resilient to these kinds of problems. And then, as I mentioned earlier, even though it's counterintuitive to consider giving any kind of outplacement services to people who are being fired with cause, depending on what those people know, it may actually be a very wise investment to make sure that those people stay more focused on things that are constructive and may help them land in another job rather than leaving them idle and financially vulnerable with all those corporate insights that they could somehow leverage in ways that may not suit the organization well.
Very good. Well said. So, any other questions, Tom, from your point of view?
No, I think this has been great having you on the podcast, Helen.
Yeah, maybe Helen, if you want to take a moment to give people your contact or web information, Twitter, etc., we'd be happy to let you share that.
And I'm not sure if you also include any notes with your podcast.
Absolutely.
Okay, so I can certainly send you some links.
Okay.
But if someone is curious, then instead of wondering how do you spell Helen Ofosu, you can find me as drheleno.ca. That's a URL that's a little more user-friendly. There aren't that many Helen Ofosus, Ofosu, so that's pretty easy. If you Google me, you'll find my website, my LinkedIn, my Twitter, all those kinds of things. But again, I'll send you some links.
Excellent. Yeah, we'll have them in the show notes then. And so again, thanks very much, Helen, for joining us. And I guess we can just throw in our contact information here before we end this episode. We have a call-in number if you have any comments or questions you'd like to have passed on to Helen or to us. The phone number is 613-693-0997. And Tom, what's our email address?
It is feedback@sharedsecurity.net.
Excellent. Great. Well, we want to thank you very much, Helen, for joining us, and we'll maybe have you back again sometime when, especially if there are news stories that, that play into that situation. But feel free to come back and join us. That's right.
Thank you both. It's been a real pleasure for me. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks very much, and thanks everybody for listening. And we will talk to you again in a few weeks.